While President Trump defends stripping security clearance from former CIA Director John Brennan, he's gearing up to revoke more clearances from his critics and those involved in the Russia investigation. That's according to a new report in the Washington Post. But if President Trump thought he would silence his critics by making this move, he was wrong. More than a dozen former top intel officials are publicly chastising the president for his decision. In a letter, 13 former directors at the CIA and DNI say, quote, insinuations and allegations of wrongdoing on the part of Brennan while in office are baseless. The president's action has nothing to do with who should and should not hold security clearances and everything to do with an attempt to stifle free speech. We have never before seen the approval or removal of security clearances used as a political tool. One of the letter's co-signers, former acting CIA Director Mike Morell, says it sends a message to other security officials.
This, in our view, was an intent to intimidate them. And the risk here is that a number of people will no longer speak out because they'll be afraid of the president taking action against them.
That's not all. The Navy admiral who oversaw the raid that killed Osama bin Laden is blasting the president as well. William McRaven writes in the Washington Post, quote, Dear Mr. President, former CIA Director John Brennan, whose security clearance you revoked on Wednesday, is one of the finest public servants I have ever known. Few Americans have done more to protect this country than John. He's a man of unparalleled integrity whose honesty and character have never been in question, except by those who don't know him. Therefore, I would consider it an honor if you would revoke my security clearance as well, so I can add my name to the list of men and women who have spoken up against your presidency. Like most Americans, I'd hoped that when you became president, you would rise to the occasion and become the leader this great nation needs. A good leader tries to embody the best qualities of his or her organization. A good leader sets the example for others to follow. A good leader always puts the welfare of others before himself or herself. Your leadership, however, has shown little of those qualities. Though through your actions, you have embarrassed us in the eyes of our children, humiliated us on the world stage, and worst of all, divided us as a nation. If you think for a moment that your McCarthy-era tactics will suppress the voices of criticism, you are sadly mistaken. The criticism will continue until you become the leader we prayed you would be, end quote. Now, if anyone needs a reminder of Brennan's public service, here it is. He joined the CIA in 1980. He spent most of his time as an analyst, eventually serving 3 presidents, both Republican and Democrat. Rising through the ranks, he served as CIA Chief of Staff and then as Deputy Executive Director, where he helped establish the National Counterterrorism Center. He retired from the CIA in 2005 after 25 years with the agency to work in the private sector. In 2008, Brennan advised then-Senator Barack Obama during his presidential campaign and then served as President Obama's Homeland Security Advisor for 4 years. Obama nominated him to the CIA director job in January of 2013, and he was sworn in 2 months later. We should note Brennan is currently a senior national security intelligence analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. Joining me now, Joshua Geltzer, Senior Director for Counterterrorism at the National Security Council under President Obama, and Bill Kristol, Editor-at-Large of the Weekly Standard, with whom we were just talking. Bill, there's a piece on the Weekly Standard site arguing that Brennan is a political hack and no hero. As you mentioned before the break, you're no fan of John Brennan's. How does that square with your view on what the president has done?
Yeah, it doesn't at all justify what the president has done. I had lunch this week with someone who served in the Bush administration, very senior levels, and he was joking, this was before this story broke, about having the pain of having to renew his security clearance, which he had kept throughout the Obama administration as a matter of routine, even though he had written many pieces for the Weekly Standard and others criticizing policies and even personnel in the Obama administration, criticizing speeches of President Obama and so forth. So this is really, I mean, there's been a very strong tradition of bipartisanship here, regardless of how much, unless there's a genuine reason to remove the clearance. Right. You know, it's part of it is about intimidation, as people were saying, but I think part of it is about an attempt to discredit the entire. I mean, it's sort of an attack. It's part of the attack on the deep state. Don't believe any of these. What Trump is telling people, especially his supporters, is don't believe any of these intelligent people.
They're all liars.
Yeah, they're all liars. They're all deep state. They're all just in the business of attacking. They stand up for each other. So when you next see Mike Hayden, or when you next see Bob Gates, or you see Leon Panetta on, I think so. This is not. Again, I very much disapprove, obviously, what Trump's done politically from his point of view. There's a method to his madness, I'm afraid.
So, Josh, this is the problem, though, that if the attack on the deep state state continues. What it does, what it's shown us in other historical settings in other countries, is that it allows a leader and that leader's cabal to be able to say whatever they want to say because they fended off criticism of the court, they fended off criticism of the civil service, they've fended off criticism of the media. They've sort of created a bubble amongst their supporters that say, just listen to me. Everybody else is sort of giving you hogwash.
It's dangerous, and that's part of why I think it's gratifying to see this remarkable collection of voices, bipartisan, some of the most distinguished, respected military and intelligence officers who've served this country in recent decades come out quickly and come out forcefully in defense of Director Brennan, and more importantly, in response to what the president has done here. Because this group knows, well, all of us who've had security clearances know, that it's not a perk, it's not some sort of political spoil to be given to friends of the president and taken away from those he doesn't like. It's a serious tool to be used for serious national security work.
What happens, let's just follow with your logic here, Bill. Does the president move forward and start to strip the clearance of people involved in the Mueller investigation?
Yeah, well, he said he would do it to Bruce Ohr, who's a lawyer at the Justice Department, and then he's going to just go down to mid-level people whose comments he doesn't like and start stripping them. Then you really do get to intimidation, because these people don't have the sort of job opportunities that a John Brennan or Clapper and others have, but you do get to an attempt to discredit everyone. I was also struck, just thinking about it a little more, the president said at one point in the little stand-up he did today before leaving the White House that it's terrible what they've done to Manafort, to Paul Manafort. That is a very characteristic comment by a demagogue, by someone who, right? I mean, who is the they? There's a legal system here, right? He's in effect saying this giant conspiracy, a ton of lawyers, presumably the judges who didn't dismiss the case, all the witnesses, many of them, people working in banks and, in normal jobs who've testified to the, honestly, as apparently, I would think. That kind of rhetoric, the discredit, the they is out to get you. Yeah. That is the paranoid style in American politics. It's the style of the demagogue. And in that respect, a lot of what he does in attacking Mueller and taking away the security clearance from Brennan and defending Manafort, it's all of a piece.
Josh, I sort of I like Bill's analysis on this being about discrediting writ large anybody involved in the Mueller investigation, or the idea that Russians were involved in the election, or frankly anybody who's a critic of the president. But it's not entirely divorced from the idea of intimidation of those in the intelligence and intelligence gathering community. What role does this play as the president starts naming people like Bruce Ohr, whom the country doesn't know, and people who maybe get more junior in the Justice Department or in the intelligence system? What is the actual message that some of these people who are working in these jobs will take?
The message seems to be speak out against this presidency, or even do your job, because of course that's what Director Brennan was doing in relation to some of the Russia analysis that he was asked to do by the previous president. So speak out, do your job, do some combination of those, and you will suffer the wrath of this president. And to lose your clearance if you are in government can radically change the opportunities available to you. Of course, there are some jobs in government that require a clearance to do them, and the opportunities outside of government that are linked to clearances are numerous. It's not something that's given out because the government is rewarding people for government service. The government wants some people outside of government to have those clearances, to offer continuity, to help defense contractors with the work that the government needs done, and to chill speech is worrisome for the speech, and it's worrisome because those are needs of this government.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there, and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.